Hi, well, welcome back to Genesis 4, where we continue after Cain has killed his brother Abel and had a conversation of sorts with Yahweh, where he leaves God's presence and goes off to build a city. We're only going to cover 3 verses here because there's so much going on, not just in the text itself, but in the world behind the text that we're going to look at from a couple of angles. So let's just jump into where we are, and when we get to verse 17, we'll explore some other aspects of this. So as a reminder of what we've been looking at here, our section in chapter 4 is now finishing the chiasm that started back at the beginning of the chapter, right after Eve's celebration of her co-creating a human with God, and now we come to the end in verses 15 and 16. We'll also be continuing, as I want to note here, in the beginning of the next part. So you see in this other chart on the right side, part 2 of chapter 4, each of these sections beginning with the man knowing his wife or his woman. And so we're actually going to overlap the first part and the second part, but that's because the city part seems so important to me in relation to the end of this, and we'll pick up the generations from Enoch to Lamech next time. So let's keep the Hebrew text up on the screen for this first part of this, because there are a number of words that we want to look at in some detail. So it ended with Cain's complaint that he would be a fugitive and a wanderer, and we pick up now in verse 15, where it's the final scene. And we have this quote here from White, who tells us this: "The immediate and dramatic response of the divine voice to Cain's lament and complaint is striking in its role reversal. Yahweh the curser becomes Yahweh the protector. The words of the murderer have been heard with compassion, and authentic dialogue is signified. The occurrence of this micro-dialogue at the end of the narrative, rather than its beginning, has the effect of reasserting the primacy of the word with regard to the events which follow." Which may be a fancy way to say that even though Cain is a murderer, and even though he's being condemned to be a wanderer, Yahweh is still in relationship with him if he chooses to be so. And as we've seen, Genesis does not narrate in the kind of Christian categories of mercy, forgiveness, and redemption, but rather in the questions of relationship and presence. So we won't see Christian language here, because of course it's not a Christian book, but the fact that Yahweh is still with him and is protecting him shows the sign of God's enduring protection, even for a wandering, lonely murderer. So Yahweh's response is, "Not so that anyone who meets me may kill me. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance." And Yahweh put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. So a couple of things to think about here. First of all, what other people? If we take the story not just literally, but in terms of its narrative logic, these are the only people. At this point, there's Adam and Eve, Yahweh and Cain, and that's it. So this is anticipating something that is obviously out of the audience's world, where there's peoples out there, because in the immediate story world, there are no people out there. It's one of many ways that the authors, as we might say, break the frame and speak directly to the readers in ways of saying, plainly, we're not writing about the beginning of time. And there are many examples in these chapters. Another one will come up in a couple of verses, as we'll see. So whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. This is the first of 243 sevens in the Hebrew Scripture. We saw in a previous chart, and I can show it to you again now, the various sevens, but these weren't the word 7. These were things used 7 times. And so now we're actually seeing the word 7 so many times. The question of 7-fold vengeance, though, can be taken in a number of ways, and what I have down here in my note is from John Byron, who wrote an entire monograph on the Cain and Abel story. So he says, given the language of the Hebrew here, which we won't look at in the detail he does, the 7-fold vengeance could mean that Cain's killer and 6 of his relatives would die. In other words, 7 people would die for one. Or another version is that the 7th generation, so this would be across 7 generations, so the person who stands 7th in the line of Cain or Adam would be killed. Or the completely translation, 7-fold as an expression of fullness. It could be interpreted as poetic speech to imply divine retribution without it actually being a literal 7. And we'll see that play out again in verse 24 when Cain's descendant Lamech speaks of 7-fold and 70-fold vengeance. This is the first time we're hearing about vengeance in this particular form, and verse 24 are only here in the Hebrew Bible. We won't get in the grammar of the Hebrew, and as you can see from my note below, the root word for vengeance is used 35 times in Hebrew Scripture, and there's a few examples. But this particular form is limited to this chapter right here. So Yahweh put a mark, and the phrase for put a mark, vayasem ot, is an unusual translation here, because it usually refers to, and I'll show you one example from Exodus 10:2 here, the signs I have done among them. And as scholars have noted, this phrase is usually, as Westerman says in my note below, for the most part, an event. So the phrase vayasem ot means that God has done something that's a sign of God's power. Here, translating as put a mark on Cain is an unusual way to put it, but it makes sense to most commentators because it seems to be something associated with Cain that others would recognize. As you can see from my note below, the early rabbinical commentary, often full of humor, suggests that God gave him a dog as his companion, and we can't say that's not the case, but there's certainly nothing in the text to support it. Ched Myers, as so often, has an incisive comment on this, and I'll share it with you here. He says, this tattoo of taboo, a lovely phrase about this, could function in two ways. On one hand, it warned people of the land to watch out for aggressive farming cultures. On the other, it cautions the reader against thinking that the problem of Cain can be solved by killing Cain. In other words, you can't solve the question of murder with more murder. So God protects Cain from being killed and warns others that he's someone to be avoided so that his farming and violence mentality is not infected by others. And then we have the fatal verse in 16. Cain went away from the presence of Yahweh, literally from the face of Yahweh. And it's ironic in the extreme, because at one level, readers, even at this point in reading the Bible from Genesis 1 forward, know there's no place to go to hide from the face of Yahweh. Yahweh can see everything and sees the whole creation, etc. Saw Adam and Eve, before they were Adam and Eve, the man and the woman in the garden, and many other examples of Yahweh being there, as we'll see in the Tower of Babel story in chapter 11 again, and many times in Genesis. So it's really saying Cain turned his back on God. We could put it more colloquially and say Cain gave God the finger, a way of saying, I'm done with you. It's not that God has gone anywhere, but Cain is done with God. And it's very important to see that what follows is the expression of the first human away from the presence of God. He settled in the land of Nod. And there's all the jokes here, we see more. Settled in the land of Nod, which means wandering or restless life. As Westerman notes, it's not a geographic name, it's a metaphor. So the person who's sentenced to be a wanderer, a wavering wanderer, settles in the land of wandering. And then he'll build a city. So he violates the order to wander. And we'll see that echoing again into the Tower of Babel, where the people are concentrated, violating the command to be fruitful and multiply and scatter across the earth. So these city building people tending to stay in one place, representing the mode of settlement. And so what we're seeing now at this point in Genesis 4 is the chapter started with the woman whose name means living, bringing life with the help of God, and now we see Cain, whose name might mean smith or acquired, as we saw in that very verse where he was birthed in verse 1, as going away from God after having been the first murderer. So a stark contrast of co-creating life with God at the beginning of the chapter and killing and creating a city away from God toward the middle and toward the end of the chapter here. Genesis establishing the two poles of human existence in relation to God or not in relation to God right here at the start. So he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And this is where we'll get one of many comments from the great Jacques Ellul, whose book, The Meaning of the City, that you can see here, is one of the transformative books for me and for many in the radical discipleship movement in understanding the role of violence and God from a theological perspective here. So as he notes, the East has an exact meaning in the Scriptures. It is both the road man takes, for his gendered language in the 1960s, in his futile search for eternity, and the one he takes when he obeys God's call. So it can go either direction there. And then we come to verse 17. And verse 17, as I just noted, is the beginning of a new section and a new part of the chapter, but because it involves building a city, we have to recognize that we can approach this from several perspectives here. So let's just ponder this for a moment before we look in more detail at this verse. We can do, as we've just been doing now, from the perspective of the plot in Genesis, so what Cain does after he leaves God's presence in this immediate plot. But we can also see it from the perspective of a presumed exilic audience against the background of Enuma Elish and their time in Babylon, which we will look at more in just a moment. And finally, we could look at it from the perspective of what we know today about the origins of cities. And we're not going to look at that in great detail because that would be a course in itself. But I want to highlight a number of books that at least have informed my understanding of this as we go. So in addition to Jacques Ellul's wonderful book, written a long time ago, also written a long time ago, is Lewis Mumford's The Meaning of the City. Lewis Mumford, as you may know, was an architect and then city planner and then became one of the first historians of city life. This book, a National Book Award published in the 1960s, is really foundational foundational for understanding cities as both attractive and imprisoning. So people are drawn to it, but also trapped in them is one of his major points. But I'd also like to look, at least note here, a couple of more recent things. So especially most recent here is the book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. And you may know David Graeber, the anarchic anthropologist who's famous for the term the 99% and the 1, and his earlier book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So Graeber has long established the goal to look at the origins of the human structures we take for granted. And in this book, he looks at the origins of inequality through the formation of agriculture and cities. And we'll explore more of that later, but he adds a lot of data to it. I guess both of the Davids here add a lot of data to it, but it's not data that the Genesis audiences would have known. So rather than try to use it to correct the errors of Genesis, as they try to do in their book, I'd like to just note in the background that we now can know much more about the origins of cities than the Genesis authors had, and that may be relevant, but we're really going to focus on what they could know at the time. And one of the things they knew at the time, because of their relationship in Babylon, was Enuma Elish. And we've looked at Enuma Elish a number of times already, and we'll see it more all through this primeval history and really throughout the book of Genesis. And I'd like to offer simply this one quote from Tablet 5 to give some context for it. We're talking here about Marduk, the chief of the younger gods who gets power by destroying their mother god and has a city built as his royal city. And this is what we hear in Tablet 5 of Enuma Elish. Below, I have hardened the ground for a building site. I will build a house. It will be my luxurious abode. I will found therein its temple. I will appoint its inner rooms. I will establish my sovereignty. When you come up from the Apsu for assembly, you will spend the night in it. It is there to receive all of you. When you descend from heaven for assembly, you will spend the night in it, for it is there to receive all of you. I will call its name Babylon, which means the houses of the great gods. I will build it with the skill of craftsmen. And let's take a quick look here at Google Maps, and we can see this city in relation to the other cities at the time. And I'll scroll back out here so you can see where we are in the Middle East, in Iraq. Because one of the issues is the Enuma Elish is a 2nd century BCE text, and certainly by the time the exiles were there in 6th century BCE, it was a long-established text. But Babylon, or Neo-Babylon as scholars call it, the Babylon of the 1st millennium BCE, was not only not the first Babylonian kingdom in the region, it was the third, at least the third major political empire in the area, the first being Sumer. And so Sumer's ancient documents, one of which we'll look at in chapter 5 when we look at the genealogy, and we'll compare the Sumerian kings list, establishes older orders of being. So let's focus in on this map and look at 3 cities, at least the remnants of them. Down the south here is Eridu, and we'll see Eridu is named in chapter 10 of Genesis as founded by Nimrod, one of the cities founded by Nimrod. And so we see Eridu down there in the south of Iraq. Just a little north of that is Uruk, and Uruk is understood, at least by moderns, as one of the oldest cities in the world, certainly the oldest city in this region. It's amazing we can just zoom in on this map and see the remains of it there. And then farther when we zoom out, we can go up a little farther on the map and we can see where historic Babylon is, way up here farther north. And we can even see the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate and the ancient ruins down there. So these 3 cities were among the ancient cities of the world, and in various Babylonian texts are described as the first city. All of those connected with the Babylonian Empire. And if we wanted to, we could explore a lot more detail of that. We're not going to now because I really want to focus on the text. But the point I want to get to here is that the authors of this text in Babylon had heard these stories about the Babylonians inventing these cities by the gods before there were humans. And so this story we're seeing in verse 17 here is plainly a parody or satire on the Enuma Elish and the other Babylonian claims. So let's look at verse 17 a little more closely here. As my note says, this is part 2 of this section of the chapter, and we'll see the genealogy that follows. So Cain, like his father in verse 1, knew his woman, and she conceived and bore, just as she conceived and bore Enoch, or bore Cain himself. Enoch here, a translation, almost a transliteration of the Hebrew Hanok here. First of 4, there's other Enoch's we'll see later. And the name can either mean inauguration or dedication, so close to the current Jewish feast of Hanukkah, the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after Seleucid desecration of it. And as Elul again helps us to note, inauguration is opposed to creation, for in Cain's eyes it is not a beginning again, but a beginning. God's creation is seen as nothing. And there are some translation issues here in the second half of the verse, and I don't want to get in too much detail on it, but we need to focus on those. So let's look closely at the words that are left here. And he built a city. So originally, he built is the question, is it the he Cain or the he Enoch? And I won't get in all those details now because it doesn't really matter for our purpose, but I'm assuming it was Cain who built the city, not Enoch. And the phrase for built here, bone ir, building a city, suggests not a single event but a lifelong occupation, as Casuto notes. Because plainly what was being narrated is a political cartoon. As if Cain said to his wife, "I'll be back in a few minutes, dear. I'm going out to build a city." Who's it for? A city is obviously not a one-man building project, nor was it even a one God building project, because Marduk didn't build it. It was built for him as the king. And then in Enuma Elish, he built humans to people it, to do the dirty work. So obviously the idea of a one-man building project here of a city, not just a backyard shed or something, is a cartoon, that the first city is made by the first murderer who is turned away from God. And how fitting that is as we see this lovely image from the LA Catholic Workers Hennessy House, where I first got this connection with Elul way back probably 30 plus years ago by now. So thank you to Jeff Dietrich and the LA Catholic Worker for introducing me to Jacques Ellul and the question of Cain and the building of a city. The word for city is ir in Hebrew, and it's over 1,000 times in Hebrew scripture, but it can interestingly also mean agitation or terror or rage. So the word city itself is already associated with violence in a way that's certainly not in English, where we get it from the Latin, and it's all about civility and peacefulness. And so this is something else. And Ellul notes the city is not just a collection of houses with ramparts, but also a spiritual power. And that affected the work of Walter Wink, who we'll look at other places as well, who has reminded us in the New Testament language of powers that collaborative entities like cities, nations, or in our world corporations are never just the sum of their parts, but they collect like a beehive into an intelligence or mentality that exists beyond the individuals themselves. And cities are certainly like that, and we'll see more of that in Genesis. So one of the issues here is the wordplay, and I'll show you this here in the Hebrew of verse 17. So there are two wordplays here. One on built and of his son. So you can see in the transliteration here, he built bone of his son Binau. So just reversing the sounds of the consonants, the order of the consonants. But also a play into the next verse with Ha'ir, the city, and in the next verse, Irad. And that's what connects us with Eridu, this one of the two cities that we just saw there on the map. So that would suggest that the city built by Enoch was Irad. Either way, it still functions as the same kind of satire. So he named it, or literally called its name Enoch. Again, whether it's after his son Shem again here, he Shemmed it after his son Enoch. And so we see this paradigm established here in verse 17. In this patriarchal world of curse away from God, women bring children and men build cities. And we looked briefly at building earlier, and we saw that first God built humans and now Cain builds a city. And so we'll see more building when Noah builds an altar, and we'll see various other buildings as we go through. Before we leave, what I have up here, the question of Eridu here brings up this piece, and I found this a very helpful piece from Peter Esbeck here, because he highlights that some Babylonian texts say that Marduk built Eridu, which is clearly an older city than Babylon. And he notes here, and I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just read part of the yellow part at the bottom. So no doubt the text arose in Eridu from the cult of Enki, one of the earlier Sumerian gods. But when Babylon and its god Marduk had risen to be the head of the pantheon toward the end of the second millennium BC, an editor ineptly changed the text to make Babylon the first city and Marduk its patron god as the prime creator. Since Marduk was Enki's son, the change was not too radical. So even amongst the Babylonians and the Sumerians, they had their own competing myths, and many have argued that as the polity moved north along the map we saw, the narrative changed to justify why the focus had gone from Uruk to Eridu up to Babylon. And so that gets us through 3 verses. And I hope we can pause there to recognize how Genesis, in just a few short words, is making amazing claims that challenge us to this day and present a paradigm that, again, people like Graeber and Wengru will argue about in terms of the facts, but the Genesis authors, as we've seen, are not trying to convey facts. Genesis is not about factual history, but about how to understand the experience of exile after the end of the monarchy and the destruction of Jerusalem. And from that perspective, they take this radical position that it's not a matter of having a better king or a king unlike some of the bad kings. It's not a matter of purifying Jerusalem in some way. It's not a matter of getting rid of the foreign women, as texts like Ezra and Nehemiah say. It's not even a matter, as the book of Leviticus calls for, to have proper worship connected with just economic practices like Jubilee, as wonderful as those are. Genesis, almost certainly written in roughly the same time as Leviticus and before Ezra and Nehemiah, says the building of the city is the root of the problem. The first sinner, the first murderer turned away from God is the source of this social order we know as the city, a threat to God's creation and to God's humans as we go. So we'll see more of that as we explore this continuing narrative of downfall, from the beauty and gift of the garden to the establishment of a counter order, one made by humans in the face of God's creation. See you next time. Bye-bye.